Chad. It's a crossroad between African civilizations, east, west, north, and south. The words that came from the people of Chad are a combination of Afro-Asiatic, West Chadic, West African, Southern African, and North African. I've already talked about the true history of the North African and Chadic civilizations and how they came together to form alliances against European powers. But this is not all we need to think about, because in later years they would continue these coalitions. But first, what does this mean for North Africa? What does it mean in North Africa to know that since the 8th century BC, and again, as soon as Westerners get into Africa, we already see that there's combination. This must mean that this combination existed prior to the European incoming. People didn't just start talking to each other as soon as Europeans came, people in Africa. So let's go back to it. So what does that mean for North Africa? That means the people of North Africa had always had a access to Chadic people, West African people, and in my opinion, East African people. We know this is a fact because if we look at Ramesses II, Ramesses II and his armies, 1000 BC, prior New Kingdom, he utilizes and occupies spaces in Asia by utilizing both Nubian and Libyan warriors. Some of them were captured in his time. The spoils of war was the Sinai Peninsula and Kadesh. So if we can go as far back as the Egyptians, looking at coalitions between Southern Africa, quote unquote Sub-Saharan Africa, and Northern Africa, then there is no reason to assume that Chad was some exception. In fact, it was not an exception. It was such not an exception that some people in Europe assumed that the people of Chad, because of their mixed race heritage when they got there in 1500s, was due to them being partially Phoenician and partially Egyptian. Now, some of these have been dismissed because obviously, why would people from Chad be Egyptian when we know that they speak completely different languages than the Egyptians and are completely different genetic stock, even to the Sudanic populations? Now, what else do we know about this place called Chad? Well, we know that after the Sao civilization, which was a native population, but was not free from outside influences like the North Africans and Southern, Western, Eastern Africans. 700 AD, the Islamic empires are expanding and they move into Africa in large numbers. The majority of the genetic influence from Eurasian stock has been seen at this period, that most of it comes from this period. Even the Berber DNA that is early on cannot be traced to Eurasian stock. So we know that the fusion or the understanding of the DNA being of mixed stock, which they interpreted as Phoenicians, is not true. But we do know that the Phoenicians and the Egyptians must have at some point come across these people because we see some of their trade goods. Well, they didn't have to get there entirely. The Kushites could have moved their resources, and that's probably why the Sao Empire was so prosperous. We then see, after this civilization, a new civilization, the Bornu civilization. This civilization was a modern civilization in the sense that it happened recently. And we actually have the King's List written in a native language in Chad. It's called the Bornu Gurgam. This Bernie Gurgram shows us that not only were there natives in their kings, but there were also so called Arabs. This is not illegal or wrong for an African civilization to have a small amount of Arabs. As we know, the Arabian civilization moved into this area. Now, I need to bring up this point. If they moved from Arabia all the way to Chad at this period, could they not have moved from Arabia into Egypt? It seems that the Arabians are very keen on spreading their DNA all over Africa, but somehow they're allergic to spreading it into Egypt, according to the Egyptologists. But that's a story for another day. Right now, let's worry about the journal of the African Society with the Kanuri, which is an easier word to pronounce than Gurgam. So we have two versions. We have one written in the original. I'm just going to read one of them in the original, then we're going to switch to English because why should we sit there? Mesebu Asami Yamanma Kurgili Bi Yamande Shie Waitu Bil Yamambe Cargo. That's the first king that is on the list. His name is actually Mesebu, son of Aisha, a lion prince of Yaman. He came from Yaman. He is Yaman. So that's what that sentence meant. And you can see that these are not names, they're titles. Titles of the kings that existed in Chad at the time. And it's interesting because, again, Africa is largely without written record, but it's not without written record. Largely. Keep that in mind. Meaning that it's not as deep. Well, some of them are burnt, but it's not as deep as other civilizations in Africa where they have an extensive amount like Egypt or Ethiopia. The Gergam then goes on to Dala, son of Aiju. He is at Nguru. That's the 19th king. And then we skip to the 41st king, Usman, son of Daudu, prince of Bursulum. He lies at Bursalem, Gwala. And then we skip to the 58th king, Mibarima, son of Gumsu, in whose time to one wet season there were 7 autumns and milk was plenteous, even yearling heifers yielding milk and young kings. He lies at Galagati. This list, which is finished off with the 66th king, and we know that this empire went all the way to the 18th and 19th century, meaning that it ended as a modern civilization. It's one of the most long lived civilizations in Africa. Not only does it detail the king's names, but this is actually one of the biggest things or reports we have that detail what happened in that area at the time. Writing in Ethiopia can go far back, even to the times of the land of Punt, where writings about Egyptian pharaoh woman went to, at least we think, Somalia or Eritrea, and wrote about her experience there and how the queen looked and everybody and people dancing around her and stuff like that. We know that she passed by Ethiopia in order to get there, whether it is in Somalia or Eritrea. So we know we have some writings that go back at least to the ancient Egyptians. We then have later writings, but let's not talk about that because that is such a long story. Let's talk about a specific moment in time. So I did talk about Haley's Comet and I talked about all of that, but that was only to ramp up the fact that in Ethiopia there was multiple things written in Gaiz that showed the tracking of stars, the tracking of comets, and all of that. And one of them came from some ex Muslims who were escaping persecution in Islamic lands, and they ran into the arms of Christian Ethiopia. And when they got there, they got to Harar and set up, firstly, a half Muslim, half Christian area, and then secondly, some of the best manuscripts ever written, which were then carefully preserved in our time. These manuscripts speak of something complicated and vast. First of all, most of them were Sufis, which is interesting, and they also have local calendars and how calendars were created by these Christians. For example, we see here a 19-year calendar. Apparently, this was taken from UNESCO. Some of my favorites of these are these lunar charts that show the different phases of the moon. And you can see there that it's very patient work, and they keep things in mind. But they didn't just invent everything on their own. They weren't stupid again. People who lived back in the day liked getting good ideas from outside. And so you can see here that there is a manuscript that has been translated from Abu Shakir ibn Brutus ibn al-Rahib called Kitab al-Tawarik. And this translated book, as an astronomy, shows the curiosity that the Ethiopians had for the world. It's underappreciated how many books were taken from outside and translated, because again, that was usually what happened in that era. There's Ethiopian books translated, there's Ethiopians translating books, books being translated in Europe, Europeans translating other books. In fact, I think the first printed Quran was printed by Europeans, but they were unsuccessful in selling it to the Middle Easterners. We can sit here, by the way, and talk about how smart all of these things are, talk about the patience of the phasing, but can we just appreciate the colors and everything that are used on these manuscripts? There's something about old texts and what they look like and what they represent that almost makes me feel like the culture that we live in today is one that is taking all the information that has been gathered in the ancient world and squandering it. If this is how much that these people could do, if this is how much they could do with the little information they were given, why are we so stuck given how much information we're given today? We have more information than we know what to do with, and yet we don't do much with it. Looking at the numbers of the Arabic and the English together, you can easily tell that the English took the number zero firstly, then they took 1, 2, 3, 6, and 9. You can see that they almost look identical to each other, just they're tilted sideways. But if you look at the Gaiz numbers, this is what they look like. It's funny how when you read about Africa, they always say Africa is without writing. But then when you read from Africans themselves, it seems like we were full of them. So much so that they're only being translated now. In fact, how many of you have even heard of these?